Karen from the HOA called the cops to get rid of my terrible fence. But when the officer took off his glasses, she had no idea he was my brother. And after his next question, her face went pale. What happened next was pure humiliation for her. But let's start from the beginning. Living in an HOA neighborhood is like signing up for lifelong surveillance of your every move. I knew moving here might come with some headaches, but I never thought a simple fence could start an all-out war. My name is Brian. I'm 34, work remotely, live a quiet life, and don't like people meddling in my business. After a couple of years in this neighborhood, I realized one thing. There are way too many nosy eyes. So, it was time to set some boundaries. That's how my beautiful, sturdy wooden fence came to be, to keep prying eyes out of my yard. But, as it turned out, my neighbor, Karen Wilkinson, had a very different opinion on the matter. The first strike. Karen is the textbook definition of an HOA fanatic. A woman in her mid to late 50s, sporting a haircut that looks like an upside-down salad bowl, always dressed in solid-colored blouses and perfectly pressed slacks, like she's attending a cult meeting for neighborhood surveillance. I hadn't interacted with her much before, but I always noticed her sharp, hawk-like gaze, scanning for anything to complain about. It took only 3 days after I put up my fence for my mailbox to start filling up with letters from the HOA. They claimed my fence was disrupting the aesthetic balance of the street, looked out of place, and was ruining the neighborhood's overall appearance. Honestly, that was the most hypocritical statement I'd ever heard. Why? Because Karen Wilkinson had been single-handedly destroying the neighborhood's aesthetics for years. Right in front of her house sat an aggressively bright artificial green lawn, so fake it looked like someone had painted the dirt. On top of that, she had at least 10 plastic flamingos scattered across her yard. 10, lined up like some creepy army, ready to attack anyone who dared question her style choices. But apparently, my wooden fence was the thing that broke the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. The first confrontation. I ignored the letters. First, because I had checked all the local regulations before installing the fence. The height was within limits, I didn't need a permit, and I hadn't broken a single rule. But Karen wasn't going to back down. One morning I walked outside and found her standing next to my fence with a tape measure in hand. She was muttering something under her breath, taking notes in a small notebook like she was conducting a serious investigation. I walked up to her. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilkinson. Need any help?" Karen didn't even look at me, but her lips pressed into a tight line. Then, without warning, she spun around and snapped. "Your fence is too tall. It's illegal." I smirked. "Actually, no. It's within code." Her posture stiffened immediately. Her face turned red, as if I had just embarrassed her in front of a crowd. "I know the HOA rules. This fence is not allowed." Her voice had a hysterical edge to it. I sighed. "HOA rules? Are you sure? Let's check the regulations." I reached for my phone, but Karen quickly turned on her heel and stormed back to her yard, gripping her notebook like it was a battle trophy. I already knew she wasn't going to let this go. And I was right. Calling the cops. The next day, I was peacefully sipping my morning coffee on the porch when I saw a police car pull up in front of my house. I squinted. Did she seriously call the cops over a fence? Now, this was getting interesting. I put my mug down, stepped off the porch, and waited to see who would step out of the car. And that's when I got the biggest surprise of the day. A man in a dark blue police uniform stepped out, a solidly built guy in his late 30s with a serious expression and dark sunglasses. He took a step forward, glanced at me, then at Karen, who was already hurrying toward him, waving her arms like she was about to report the crime of the century. Then the officer slowly removed his sunglasses, and I barely held back my laughter. It was my brother, Jonathan Harper. I blinked. Well, this just got interesting. I hadn't seen John in a while, and I definitely wasn't expecting our reunion to happen like this. But of course Karen had no idea. Classic Karen. She practically invaded John's personal space, her voice suddenly taking on an exaggeratedly distressed tone. "Officer, this man put up an illegal fence. It's a disaster." John raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to process why the hell he had been dragged into this. He looked at me, then back at Karen, and after a brief pause asked, "A disaster? As in, he built a fence on his own property?" "Yes!" Karen nodded frantically. "And it's ruining the entire street. The HOA already issued a violation." John slowly turned to look at me. I shrugged, smirking. "Yep. Guilty as charged. Built a fence. Terrible, right?" John let out a long sigh. He was clearly at a loss for words. He turned back to Karen and, lowering his voice slightly, asked, "Ma'am, you called the police over a fence?" Karen stomped her foot, her face flushing red. "Yes, the HOA already issued a violation. He's breaking the rules." "Rules? Or laws?" John tilted his head. Karen hesitated. "Well, the HOA..." "All right, ma'am." John pulled out his notepad and pretended to start writing something down. That's when Karen's face noticeably paled. "So, just to confirm, you're admitting to abusing emergency services for a personal dispute?" Karen realizes her mistake. Silence. Karen's expression shifted instantly, from her usual self-righteousness to full-on panic. She blinked rapidly, clearly trying to come up with an excuse. Well, I mean, it's just..." John closed his notepad and shot me a tired look, the kind that said, "Really, Brian? This is your life? You deal with this?" I barely contained my laughter. Karen nervously glanced around as if someone was going to swoop in and save her. I just wanted..." But there was only one way out of this, and she wasn't going to like it. Karen blinked, her lips trembling. It seemed she had just realized she had crossed a line, and there was no way to take it back now. But of course, Karen wouldn't be Karen if she didn't try to wriggle out of it. "But it ruins the view!" she blurted out, her voice turning shrill and desperate. That was her last argument, her final hope, her lifeline, one that absolutely no one needed. John ran a hand over the back of his head, let out a heavy sigh, and, with the tired professionalism of someone who had seen it all, said, "I understand, ma'am, but the law doesn't regulate the view. It does, however, regulate false police reports." I nearly choked, trying to hold in my laughter. "So here's the deal. Either I write you up for a false report, or we forget this ever happened, and you leave my brother alone." I deliberately avoided looking at Karen because I knew, if our eyes met, I'd lose it and burst out laughing. Karen's collapse. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hands clenched into fists, her shoulders trembled, and her face contorted into a mixture of anger, fear, and sheer helplessness. She had lost, but she couldn't admit it. She stammered, desperately trying to come up with a comeback, but it was clear her brain had already short-circuited. I... And then she did what all people like her do when they realize they can't win an argument. She just turned around and left. No, not just left. She spun on her heel, stomped her foot as if that would add weight to her exit, and marched back to her house with her nose held high. After the battle, I let out a breath and turned to John. "You just saved me from an HOA apocalypse." John snorted, shoving his notepad back into his pocket. "Hey, that's what brothers are for, right?" We exchanged a look and both started laughing. But I knew one thing. Karen wasn't done yet. I knew Karen wouldn't back down that easily. People like her don't handle public humiliation well. Her entire existence revolved around controlling the neighborhood, maintaining a sense of power, and being absolutely convinced of her own righteousness. and now that she had been embarrassed in front of everyone, she would either try to strike back or bide her time for revenge. But what happened the next day? I never saw it coming. I was lazily sipping my morning coffee on the porch, enjoying the peaceful aftermath of the previous day's drama, when I noticed an envelope with the HOA logo in my mailbox. Oh great, what now? Ripping it open, I skimmed through the letter and laughed out loud. The HOA had rescinded their violation notice. No explanation, no apology, just an official notification. Violation rescinded. No further action required regarding your fence. Of course. After Karen nearly got fined for making a false police report, the HOA had decided to back off. Either they realized they didn't want to deal with my brother, or Karen had gotten chewed out by the other board members for her ridiculous stunt. Either way, it was over. Or at least, that's what I thought. But a few days later, something even better happened. I was sitting in my yard, rocking lazily in my chair, when I heard the sound of frustrated grumbling and the distinct rustling of plastic. I slowly turned my head and froze. Before me unfolded the most beautiful sight I could have imagined. Karen, with a stony expression, wearing gloves and holding a small sledgehammer, stood in front of her beloved pink plastic fence, the one that had surrounded her perfect rose garden for years. And she was tearing it down with her own hands. My jaw nearly dropped. Karen, the same woman who demanded my fence be removed because it ruined the view, was now dismantling her own fence. At first, she was carefully pulling out the plastic panels, stacking them neatly. But the longer she worked, the more frustrated she became. By the time she reached the third panel, she yanked it too hard, and it fell on her foot. "Damn it!" she hissed, stomping her foot in frustration. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from laughing out loud. She huffed, grumbled, muttered angrily under her breath, looking like she had been forced to tear this fence down under threat of execution. And then, I couldn't help myself. "What, does it ruin the view too?" I called out, still lounging in my chair, making sure she could hear me. She froze. The plastic panel hovered in her hands. Her face tensed, shoulders stiffened. I could see her exhale sharply, press her lips together, and say nothing. She just turned, clenched her fists, and stormed inside like a cornered cat, leaving her dismantled fence scattered across the lawn. I leaned back in my chair, took a satisfied sip of coffee, and admired my beautiful, tall, wooden fence. Legal, unshakable, victorious. The perfect ending. But the best part came the next day. That morning, as I stepped outside to grab the mail, I saw a garbage truck pull up in front of Karen's house. 2 workers climbed out, and one of them pointed at the pile of plastic fencing with an amused expression. Karen came running out onto her porch, waving her arms. "Be careful! That's high-quality material. I was going to sell it." The workers exchanged glances. One of them snorted. The other rolled up his sleeves. "Lady, this is $5 plastic from Amazon." I had to cover my face to keep from howling with laughter. Karen spun on her heel, stormed inside, and slammed the door so hard the windows shook. And me? I just smiled. HOA lost. Karen lost. And my fence was still standing. Justice had been served.